Hello, everyone. Welcome to our final day of Foundations of Politics. Let me begin by talking about the final exam. So, we will have a final exam. You will have 160 minutes. That's the normal final time to complete the final exam. And the final exam will be on Schoology. It'll be on the main course page. The exam will be available for you to take from Tuesday, May 5th, at 11:15 through Thursday, May 7th at 11:55 p.m. That's like begins at our normally scheduled final exam period and ends 2 days after the final exam period originally scheduled to end. So you can take it any time that you want during those 2 days. Just make sure you finish by Thursday, May 7th at 11:55 p.m. That's Eastern time. Like the midterm, it's an open book, open note exam. After you finish, please sign your name to that statement that you did before for the midterm. So basically, hey, this is the midterm. It's just now instead of in the middle of the semester. There will be 4 questions on the exam that will ask for short answers. You can answer 2 of them in approximately 5 sentences each. There will be 4 questions on the exam asking for long answers. You'll be asked to answer 2 of those in approximately 20 sentences each. So this is exactly the same format as the midterm exam. Okay, themes, concepts to study. I won't ask you about Plato or Brave New World or Leon Cass or Alan Bloom or C.S. Lewis. You can bring those things up if you want to, but you don't have to. Rather, here are the themes or concepts to study. From Aristotle, human beings are by nature political animals. What does that mean? Be able to discuss that. Be able to discuss natural masters and slaves. Be able to discuss the best regime in both theory and practice. Those bullet points underneath those general topics I think might be helpful for you. A complete answer will address some of those issues. Moving on to Augustine, the foundations of the 2 cities, earthly and heavenly peace, pride and anxiety, and his interpretation of Matthew, I believe it's 5, where you're instructed to turn the other cheek. Moving on to Aquinas, be able to discuss the 4 essences of law and the 4 kinds of law. What are they? What do they do? Why are all 4 necessary? Notice for the natural law, you might need to know about self-evidence and first and secondary precepts. Know about the law's attempts to promote virtue and restrain vice and to what extent it can succeed in that. And then today, we'll be discussing whether we are obligated to obey just laws, to obey unjust laws. In the context of Romans 13, 1 through 7. So these are broad themes and concepts to study. These are like the building blocks of the final exam. I will be asking questions about these issues. You can definitely expect a question about like how Christians are to understand their political responsibilities. Christian citizenship, drawing from Augustine, Aquinas, and Romans 13. You have this document in your email. Also, I uploaded it to Schoology under like assignments, and then exams, and then study guide for the final. So what question? Hello, welcome back. I hope you filled out your course evaluation by now. Let's talk about Aquinas' treatise on law. Let's finish our conversation. Why can't I see the chat? Sorry. Okay, Aquinas' political thoughts, last day of class, last discussion of Aquinas. Key theme for the day, are we obligated to obey unjust laws? are we obligated to obey unjust laws? Notice the way this question is asked. I'm getting it specifically from, I believe it's question 96, article. Sorry, just a second. Question 95, article 2. Yeah, question 96, article 4. Does human law impose an obligation in conscience on a man? Does it tie us up with the bond of duty? That's how one scholar translates this. The question here is not how much can we get away with? You know, it's not like it leans in the other direction. Instead of saying, hey, when can we revolt against government, against unjust governments? When can we overthrow it, topple it, bring it to the ground, liberate ourselves? Instead of asking that question, it leans in the opposite direction. Like, when are we obligated to obey unjust laws? Do you see how it leans in the direction of obedience rather than in disobedience? I got to talk in my APTAP 2 class today about how America is a creedal nation. In other words, we are a nation founded upon a creed, self-evident truth that all men are created equal, and I think that's a beautiful thing. And so I'm saying that to say, I love America because she stands for equal and dignified freedom for every human being. And that is a beautiful thing. So I love America to the extent that she does that, which is a pretty big extent. But America was born in revolution. We Americans love revolution. We love protests. We love overthrowing governments. We love liberty. The Christian tradition is not opposed to liberty, but dispositionally, it asks for obedience to authority. So you might think of it this way. Instead of like a sea of revolution with just like a little island of obedience to authority, the Christian tradition sees politics as like a sea of obedience to authority with an island of revolution. The emphasis is on obedience to authority rather than on revolution. But there are laws that are unjust, and when are we obligated to obey them and obligated to disobey them? Today, let's talk about that. Before we get into Aquinas, let's talk about Scripture. Romans 13, 1 through 7 is perhaps the most important, certainly like the most extensive single discourse on politics in the Bible. It's 7 verses in the New Testament, in Romans, and there's like, you can pick up bits and pieces of precepts throughout the rest of the Scripture, but here's the chunk of it. Here it is. The purpose of government, according to Romans 13, 1 through 7, is that government is for your good. So on the left side of the screen, you should see the chiastic structure of this passage. Chi is the Greek letter that looks like an X. And so you can see how like whenever you look at a chiastic structure, it starts with one point, A, moves to another point, B, and then hits the thesis, the central points, the central argument of the passage. And we know this is the central part of the passage because it is not repeated. It is at the center of the passage, and it's not mirrored or repeated later in the passage. So you have A, B, C, and then we have B prime, A prime. B prime repeats the argument from B, and A prime repeats the argument of A. So I tried to like map out the entire thing on the left side. Do you see how that kind of looks like an X? A, B, C, B is repeated, A is repeated. I think it's helpful to see that the structure of the passage, and because this is a notoriously difficult thing to understand, it seems kind of ambivalent. And it also seems like sometimes it might not be true, but I think it's helpful to see that C, the C in the middle there, that is the heart of the passage. I see a comment, let me pause. Why can't I see it? Is bottom right missing a prime? Oh, no. What a fool. Oh, it is. How embarrassing. Ta-da. Yes, there you go. The chiastic structure. Hey, you already filled out your course evaluations. I can do whatever I want now. What up? Okay, so let's read Romans 13, 1 through 7. It says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgments. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. So it starts by saying you should submit to authority. And why? Because God has instituted government. Any authority that exists in the world was established by God. All authority flows from him. This is what Jesus says to Pontius Pilate, right? Pontius is like, do you have any idea of the authority I have over you? And Jesus says, hey, you don't have any authority unless it is given to you by my Father. So submit to authority because governments are instituted by God. There is no authority except from God. Let's move to B. Political authorities judge, punish, and commend. They judge and punish wrongdoing and commend good acts. They are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. Political authorities are established by God, so submit to them. And the way that they operate is to judge and punish wrongdoing and commend good actions. Now, the heart of the matter is government was instituted for your good. Verse 4, for he is God's servant for your good. This is like a really different way of thinking about governments than like the social contract, and following from that, the right to revolution. Those things aren't evil. They just operate on some different presuppositions. They end in a pretty similar place as many other Christian traditions do, but they start with different assumptions, different dispositions towards government. For the social contract theorists, government is a result of our fallen nature. Thomas Paine calls government a badge of lost innocence. it's not like totally and completely wrong. The kinds of governments that we have today are in large parts determined by our fallen nature, but government itself is not a result of our fallen nature. Second, these social contracts theorists tend to see it's like we have the rights to revolt unless you prove that you're competent and faithful to protecting our rights. This passage suggests, like, it goes pretty far in suggesting the opposite. It leans in the other direction. Submit to authority because it was established by God. Political authorities at their best judge, punish, and commend, and government is for your good. Government was established for your good. How? How does government secure our good? I think there's a lot of overlap here between Scripture and, on one hand, and then also Aristotle and Aquinas on the other hand. The greatest benefactor of all humankind, says Aristotle, was the first founder of government. It allows us to fulfill our natures, according to Aristotle, and also it keeps us from descending into animal-like evil. Human beings are worse than the beasts without laws. Government is established to a certain extent because God orders the universe and God governs the universe, but then it also exists in our fallen state in order to restrain evil, in order to provide peace. What's the verse? I have my Bible here. Let me try to find it. Always forget what this is. And I named my son. We named our son after this, partly because of this verse, and I love it. And I always forget which one it is. 1 Timothy 2. First of all, then, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for all people, but specifically for kings and all who are in high positions, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. Government provides peace. Even unjust governments provide, when they're not failed states, provide peace. So at a minimum, oh man, there could be so much wrong with the government. But at a minimum, if it's working, if it's providing order, then it's providing peace. Okay, then we follow back down the other side of the chiastic structure. Political authorities bear the sword, it mirrors B, and then A prime submits to authorities because they are established by God. It mirrors A. The central thing, though, is that government is established for your good. But what if it isn't? Or what if this particular government does? What if the laws are unjust? Oh, man. The vast history of humankind. Haven't there been a few laws that, weren't great, that weren't totally just, that weren't totally for the good of those citizens? What if the law is unjust? Aquinas answers this question in two different ways. So let's turn to question 5, article 2. Question 95. What did I say? Question 95, article 2. Let's read the I respond. For me, this is on page 52. Again, question 95, article 2. As Augustine says, a law that is not just does not seem to be a law at all. Hence, something has the force of law to the extent that it shares in justice. Now, in human affairs, something is called just by virtue of its being right, according to the rule of reason. But as is clear from what was said above, the first rule of reason is the law of nature. Hence, every humanly made law has the character of law to the extent that it stems from the law of nature. On the other hand, if a humanly made law conflicts with the natural law, then it is no longer a law, but a corruption of law. So what if government is established for our good, but what if government passes unjust laws? Well, here, Aquinas answers the question by appealing to the trans-political natural law. This is a law that is not created by human beings. It is not dependent on the majority. It exists outside of our wills. It is true and supreme, eternal and universal. And by this standard, the law either lives up or does not live up. So to the extent that a humanly made law departs from the natural law, it is not a law. It is rather a corruption of law. The word corruption here, it gets like a lot of what Aquinas is saying in the original Latin, but it like doesn't get there all the way. It's one translator calls this a putrefied carcass of a law. It's perversion. It's decay. It's corruption, yeah. It's like it's kind of a law, but it's a rotten law. So strictly speaking, it doesn't meet the standard, but yet it still retains some of the elements of law. And so even an unjust law is not wholly evil. It is not completely 100% evil. In fact, complete 100% evil is, for both Augustine and Aquinas, it doesn't really exist, right? Because to exist is a good thing. And so if something exists, then it cannot be 100% evil because existence itself is a good thing. Being, the goodness of being. That's something like what Aquinas is saying here. It exists, and so we can't like just throw it out completely, 100%, but it exists in this perverted, downgraded, corrupt, putrefied carcass of a way. So human law is unjust to the extent that it departs from the natural law. I have on the screen here the MLK Memorial in DC. In his letter from a Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King Jr. appeals to this passage in Aquinas and also to the part to the passage in Augustine that Aquinas is also quoting. This means that there's a standard outside of politics that we can use to judge whether or not a law is just or unjust. And yeah, it does seem that if we are obligated to obey laws to the extent that they are just. Certainly, we shouldn't follow a putrefied carcass of a law in the same way that we should follow a just law. Aquinas then continues and answers this question in a different way, slightly different way, in question 96, article 4. Question 96, article 4. So I have this table. I've already told you everything here now that you need to see about this. Let's read some of that. For me, this starts on page 64. It's like a couple paragraphs in. On the other hand, there are two ways in which laws are unjust. First, in counterpoints to what was said above, they are unjust when they are contrary to the human good. Either A, because of their end, as when a lawmaker imposes burdens on his subjects that contribute not to the common welfare, but to his own greed or glory. Or B, because of their author, as when someone makes laws that go beyond the authority entrusted to him, or C, because of their form, as when burdens are distributed unequally over the multitude, even if those burdens are ordered toward the common good. Laws of this sort are outrages rather than laws, since, as Augustine puts it, what is not just does not seem to be law. Hence, laws of this sort do not bind in conscience, except, perhaps, for the sake of preventing scandal or social unrest, in which case a man should cede his right in accord with Matthew 5:40-41. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2, and if someone takes away your coat, give him your cloak as well. The second way in which laws can be unjust is by being contrary to the divine good, as are tyrannical laws that induce men to idolatry or to doing anything else that is contrary to divine laws. It is not permissible to obey such laws in any way at all, since as Acts 5:29 says, we must obey God rather than men. Okay, so there are 2 different ways that human law can be unjust. It can be contrary to the divine good, or it can be contrary to the human good. I'm flipping the order because I think it's easier to understand how a law could be contrary to the divine good. A law that is contrary to the divine good essentially commands sin. This is different than a law allowing sin or permitting vices. This is a law that commands someone to disobey God. What's an example? What's an example of a law that is contrary to the divine good? Yeah, Julia, can you talk more about how Jim Crow laws would be contrary to the divine good?
Because they are completely designed to separate people and push them against one another, or more specifically, one people against a different people. And they are to disadvantage a certain group of people, which is very much what I would assume against divine law.
Well, is it a sin to do that? Well, so here's one. I'm not sure.
Well, it's like,
It's certainly evil, right? So I'm not saying that it's not evil. But what good is it contrary to? So the way Aquinas defines against the divine good, tyrannical laws that induce men to idolatry or doing something, that is contrary to divine law. I could see someone making an argument that Jim Crow laws would be contrary to divine law. If it did demand that people mistreat members of other races, then yeah, it might be against the divine law. It would have to require sin.
but like, isn't a sin, don't they say like a sin would be like cheating? Aren't you cheating other people out of living a good life if you are mistreating them?
Here's why I hesitate to say that this is against the divine good. Well, sorry, let me clarify. Here's why I think that it might better be understood as against human good, which isn't, the difference is it's just less clear what Let me try again. Contrary to the human good. A law is contrary to the human good if it's in any of the four essences of law doesn't live up to the standard. So Jim Crow laws are the end, the final cause, where the lawmaker imposes burdens on his subjects that contribute not to their common welfare, but to his own greed or glory. I could see that fitting there. Go to the third one, because of their form, as when burdens are distributed unequally over the multitude. That to me sounds like Jim Crow laws, that burdens are distributed unequally. This is the unequal treatment of people simply because of their race, the color of their skin, which is completely and totally unjust. So simply because something is against the human good does not necessarily mean, like, it's not like, oh, all of a sudden that's fine. But the unequal treatment of people, I think, goes against the formal cause of law. I think it imposes unequal treatment on people, which is unjust. It might be, Jim Crow might be unjust in the sense, like, I'm thinking of that Louisiana Rail Car Act that was upheld in the 1896 Supreme Court decision Plessy v. Ferguson. That law required railroad car operators to segregate people by race. So in that sense, I think that does violates the divine law because it requires someone to treat someone unequally simply on the basis of their race. Yeah, so as Rose has helpfully pointed out, and maybe Julia, you were saying this before, Jim Crow often required segregation. It didn't just allow segregation. And so something is contrary to the divine good if it requires sin. Yeah, okay. So in some cases, Jim Crow would be against the divine good. Now, to say that it was against the human good is not really to lessen the injustice of Jim Crow. It is rather to, it's just like a different kind of violation of justice. You see what I'm trying to say? Julia, what are you thinking? I think we're on the same page now.
Yeah, it's a multiple violation of multiple types.
Yeah, excellent way of putting it. Yeah, so Jim Crow violates both the human good and the divine good in this sense, that it requires you to segregate on the basis of race. And so this is Martin Luther King Jr.'s argument from the letter from a Birmingham jail. What is another example of a law that is against the divine good?
Would an example of this be, like, I was thinking of, like, the Holocaust and in Western Civ, like, we read the document, like, condemning the doctors of how they were like, oh, we were just following orders, but they were like, you were following orders that, like, ended, like, they were pretty much, like, command to kill people or, like, let them die, and how, like, you know, just, like, stuff during then, it was, like, the command to, like, kill and abuse these people.
Yeah, okay, so these are such terrible subjects, such terrible atrocities in human history. Yeah, I mean, that law is clearly against the divine good because it required doctors to murder innocent people. What about from literature or scripture? Do you think of laws that are contrary to the divine good?
was thinking about like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they were asked or bow down to the idol.
Yeah, I think I heard you say the example of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they were forced to bow down to the idol, King Nebuchadnezzar. Yeah, exactly. You are directly being commanded to worship something that is not Yahweh. Rose brings up laws that require apostasy or criminalize Christianity. Yes. Yes. Laws that require you to renounce your faith. Our response to laws that are contrary to the divine good are very simple. It's very simple. We must disobey. There is no room for speculation. If a law directly commands you to sin, you must disobey, according to Aquinas. Because he quotes Acts 5:29, we must obey God rather than men. Because, and to put this in Augustinian terms, we have two loyalties, but the one is totally first. Our loyalty to the heavenly city trumps our loyalty to the earthly city. And so if ever those two things come directly into conflict, we must choose our first loyalty over our second loyalty. And we should do this like for prudential reasons too, because the heavenly city houses our soul. We're talking about eternity. So what does Jim Elliot say? He's no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. Yeah, obey God rather than men. So when a law commands you to sin, you have a duty to disobey. This is easy to understand and hard to do. Do you know how you would become capable of standing up against this sort of injustice? Practicing, forming your habits in your day-to-day life so that you develop your spirited muscle, and so that when the time comes, you can say, no, I'm going to obey God rather than men. Laws that are contrary to the human good are a little bit more difficult to like pin down, and this is why I was hesitating about Jim Crow laws. Laws that are contrary to the human good violate one of the four essences of law put forward in question 90. If a law is passed for personal gain rather than for the common good, well, this goes against the final cause of law, and so it's unjust. It goes against the human good. Now, this doesn't mean that it's like it doesn't mean that it's like a lesser category of injustice necessarily. It takes a different form. If the efficient cause or the author of the law, if the person passing the law doesn't really have authority to pass this law, then that law is unjust. I'm thinking of especially heads of state who extend term limits or extend their term while they themselves are in office. So President Xi Jinping of China did this recently. He extended his term for a few more years, and I think he got rid of the term limits. So this is a combination of a law contrary to the final and efficient causes of law. He did this for his own personal good, not the good of the community. And second, I don't think he had the authority to change the terms of the election as he was already in office. A law could be against the formal cause of law. It could be unequally distributed. And this, by the way, is what, or it could be unequal in its application or distribution. And this is what Martin Luther King Jr. appeals to in his letter from a Birmingham jail. So in Birmingham, MLK is arrested for protesting without a permit. There is nothing inherently unjust or fundamentally unjust about requiring people to get permits to protest. But it is unjust to not issue those permits to a class of citizens simply because of the color of their skin. So the application or distribution of the law is unequal. Finally, a human law can go against the material cause of law. It could not be promulgated. The US Constitution forbids ex post facto laws for this reason. You cannot criminalize past behavior that was not illegal at the time it was done, because the people didn't know that it was unjust, or the people didn't know that it was illegal to do that thing when they were doing that thing. So a law, in order to be just, requires that the people have some reason to know that it exists, that it's officially announced, has to be promulgated. So laws can be contrary to the divine good, contrary to the human good. If a law is contrary to the divine good, no question about it, we must disobey. If it's contrary to the human good, there's a little bit of, there's some ambivalence here. Let me reread, well, I guess I can just read what's on the screen. This is from question 96, article 4. We already read this, but let me restate it. Laws of this source do not bind the conscience, except perhaps for the sake of preventing scandal or social unrest. There's a lot packed into this statement. Laws of this sort do not bind the conscience except perhaps for the sake of preventing scandal or social unrest. So again, notice that he doesn't say, yeah, you can revolt anytime you want to, as long as it's not scandalous or causing social unrest. No, he's saying, laws of this sort do not bind the conscience, except sometimes, maybe for the sake of preventing scandal or social unrest. What do you think he means by scandal or social unrest?
I think it's like, can I answer?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, cool. I didn't know if it was rhetorical. I think it's kind of like how it's not like necessarily a thing of God that we like God didn't rain down thunder and be like, you should stay in your homes. But I just think that it's like good for the community because it like is preventing unrest and like people getting sick. That's just my opinion.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah, okay, so let me think. So let's assume, for the sake of the argument, that stay-at-home orders are unjust. Let's just assume that for a second. Now, I'm not saying that they are. I'm saying that let's assume it for the sake of the argument. If that's the case, then maybe you should still refrain from protesting because by protesting, you would cause social unrest. This is another way of saying, remember Aquinas is the Christian Aristotle. There may be unjust traditional laws, but maybe, perhaps, maybe you should not revolt against those for the sake of peace. In other words, this is a prudential decision. Don't assume that revolutions always lead to something better. In fact, most revolutions end terribly. So bad. You exchange one tyrant for, hey, an even worse tyrant. And so if your revolting against the government is only going to cause bloodshed, chaos, disorder, and the institution of an even worse governing body afterwards, then maybe don't do it. Maybe this is a prudential decision that it would be better to live with this unjust law than to live with no laws or worse laws. So before you open up the lid to revolution, just keep in mind that most go very poorly, and that there are no guarantees in politics, right? You're not guaranteed to institute a better government just because you overthrew the last one. Brands went off about this in The Art of War, says maybe Holly, but probably Graham. Yeah, do you want to say anything about that, Graham?
Sure. He just talked about, let me look at my notes here. He said, all citizens are bound to obey their rulers, except when they're explicitly commanded to violate Yahweh's commands. Rebellions and revolutions are rarely acceptable, even when inspired by noble causes. Throughout the Old Testament, we see so much injustice and so little revolution. In some senses, disobeying order is disobeying God. So kind of just drawing from the Old Testament examples, we see a lot of individuals resisting systems, but we don't see a lot of kind of systemic changes and overthrows, even when they're in Israel or Babylon.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Oh, sorry. That's what I'm saying Aquinas is saying. This doesn't mean revolution is never the answer. It just means that as Americans, we love revolution. We love it. We're so excited about revolution. And really, we're one of the few examples of revolutions going correctly in the history of the world. So we kind of saying, it's kind of like we run across a very busy streets and don't get hit by a car. And we're that was awesome. Hey, everyone, come with us. And then everything goes terribly. Rose, so let me go back to that statement. Laws of this sort do not bind the conscience except for the sake of preventing scandal or social unrest. So we've talked about the second one, social unrest. It's not that these unjust laws bind your conscience. It's that we ought to make the prudential calculation that overthrowing these laws may do more harm than good. So that's the second thing, social unrest. But let's talk about the first thing, scandal. Rose mentioned that this is a term used for causing, or for sinning or causing someone to sin. Yeah, we are responsible for our actions, not only in the effects that they cause in the political community, but also the effects that they cause in people who look up to us. So don't be a stumbling block for other people. Use your freedom in a way that builds up people who are younger and weaker than you. So, I mean, if this means like refraining from eating certain things at the dinner table, I'm drawing from scripture here, then do that. It's not that like eating those things is in itself a sin, but it is a sin to lead people astray. And not everyone can handle having a disposition of obedience to authority established by God, and yet revolting when the laws of that system are unjust. So, in other words, Aquinas wants us to see that there's, if this is a cost-benefit analysis, there's potentially more costs that we ought to consider than simply like, well, is the law just or unjust? This doesn't mean that you should not revolt. It's just that you should count the costs. Government is established for our good. And so when laws are unjust, that doesn't mean that we are obligated to obey them out of like from our conscience, just rather it's a prudential decision for the sake of preventing scandal or social unrest. So, I don't know. I don't want to end this, but it's time. Government was established for our good. It's, in this class we talked about justice and how we'll never find it completely here on earth. But Augustine says, hey, that's okay, because we'll find it in heaven. We talked about distraction and the formation of certain habits. We talked about the importance of law in maintaining peace and order in this world. So, hey, go out into the world, love politics as it should be loved, because it establishes earthly goods like peace, but please do not put your ultimate loyalty there, because you'll be disappointed. This has been so fun. I wish that I could be there with you all in person and see your faces, but this will do for now. Final exam, it'll be available starting, what did I say, Tuesday at 11:15. You all are awesome. This was so much fun. That's all I have to say. I'll stop talking. Have a great rest of your day.